Okay, welcome to the second presentation in Module 5. We'll look at the equilibrium conditions that are written into the GTAP code. This is normally the part of a module where we would spend a lot of time searching through the code and finding all these instances. We probably won't do that because so much of the equilibrium conditions are intertwined with the advanced topics. This is the open economy model. It has trade, it has the transport, and so we'll leave sort of the review of many of the equations until you move on to the second phase of this course. We do want to get a feel for these, and we'll look at a couple of them and maybe even explain a little bit why it's considered more of an advanced topic, because the way we would use an equilibrium condition typically when we're doing analysis, well, one, we may check, to make sure everything balances, but the other is to think about if we have this change in sales or we have this price change, what are the important components on the demand side? What is driving, what is the demand side driver? Is it the foreign sales? Is it domestic? That kind of thing. And so when we typically work with an equilibrium condition in analysis, it is because we are looking at that foreign versus domestic sales, or which export markets are potentially the most important. And so with that in mind, we'll do a quick survey of what exists for equilibrium conditions in GTAP, not spending that normal amount of time in the code. Okay, so what do we have for market clearing equations? We have the commodities. Okay, so the COMM set. There we would have the domestic production being equal to the sales, right? And that can be split between margin and non-margin. We will look at that equation. We'll look at the code version of that equation. When you move on to the second phase of this course, to the advanced topics, bring in the trade as a study component. You'll look at the import supply and import demand balance that has to hold, which is part of the price system, right? So the export pricing. It'll also play a factor in the domestic basic price, because that is a component of the total disposition. And so that'll be, as you can see, we're going to get part of it here. You won't get a sort of complete picture until you've taken on all these sort of second phase advanced topics. You also have endowment supply equals endowment demand. So that's the, in the commodities, you have a production sector making something and selling it to a user. Well, here you have in the endowment, you have an owner of a primary factor selling it to one of those production sectors. Then a couple of other balance conditions that exist. The regional income constraint we've already talked about in our final demand lecture, thinking about different purchasing branches or expenditure pattern, shares for spending out the regional income. We'll review that, and then there's one more that would be worth talking about. Would be the in phase 2, when you get to the advanced topics, this global bank and global transport, two different equilibrium mechanisms that sit outside of a region. Okay, so import supply and demand is really a bilateral trade balance condition. Global bank and global transport is a global investment and a global shipping or global movement of goods balance. So every region contributes to and benefits from or draws from those. And so the prices are these sort of international prices that are important. But again, an advanced topic for later. So margin commodities, we already looked at the set. I just want to remind us that a margin commodity can be sold to anyone. It could be, if it's insurance, right? There's some domestic, insurance market where people pay for things, and certainly the margin in the domestic market, moving between not crossing any border, insurance and transport is a big component of that, but we don't have an explicit market for that, remember? So it's just sold like a regular input. But some part of that is going to be sold into international transport too. So every economy has some amount of sales that go into that, and that is the part that we'll leave out there. So when we're looking at a margin commodities market clearing equation, we've already seen with our example that we use for the percentage change, sales to the domestic market, sales to the international market, and some sales to that global transport pool. And those are the international margins. So there's a production structure out there for transportation, for moving things from region A to region B or region B to region C, and they'll draw on that global transport pool. Each region will sell units of services out into that pool according to the demand, right? The price pressure of moving those things, and they'll be contributors to it. So with that as background, let's move over to the market clearing equation for goods. We've already seen it. Here it is in percentage change form. QC, share weighting. This is a value share. Remember, it's the value of sales to the domestic market over the total value from the left-hand side. So the total commodity supply value. So you get a share. Here you get the export share by region. Right? So this is RD, source region, destination region, and C is the commodity. And so within here you get all of the trade. And then the way the equation is written in GTAP is making use of a little bit of a coding function, right? So the if function, and it just says if, when you're looking at this equation or when you're building this matrix, right? So remember, this is a variable on the left hand side here, or an equation that's defined over all the commodities in this set COMM, all the regions in the set REG. So when you're building this matrix out, if the particular commodity you're currently processing as the code is being interpreted, if that particular commodity is part of the set margins, then there's this additional component that goes in the equation, the transport share multiplied by the percentage change in the supply to the purchases from the region of the global transport pool. If it's not part of marge, then it doesn't exist. Okay? And so with a single equation in the code, you're able to get the two different equations that you might have for margin and non-margin commodities. Okay, and remember, we looked at the sets right at the beginning of the previous presentation. Commodities can be broken apart as margin and its complement, non-margin. Okay, so a single equation. We could have written two equations, one over the set margin and one over the set non-margin. And in fact, it's very possible, depending on which GTAP versions and modules you see people out there using, you may see the old version with two different equations, one for margin and one for non-margin. GTAP considers version 7 of the code the current and maintained version, but there's a lot of people that use what we would call classic or legacy GTAP, where those were split apart, have some different names. We don't train on those anymore, but the feeling is, if you learn this, then it wouldn't be, you shouldn't be surprised if you open somebody's code or they shared it with you, and you notice that they're not using version 7. Well, they're getting the same effect, right? Two different treatments based on whether it's margin commodity or non-margin commodity. And that's the important point. So you get the two different treatments here using an if function. In the older version of GTAP, you would get it through two different equations defined over different sets. This obviously has the benefit of some coding efficiency, some elegance, and keeping the equation dimensions, commodity and region, as expected. Okay, so you'll be populating the right-hand side terms differently based on what membership exists, but the equation itself is written for every element in commodity. Yeah, we mentioned a little bit about you need a market clearing for the trade, and so because it's right below there, and because I borrowed this slide from someone else who uses it in the advanced course, I wanted you to go ahead and see that this structure gets repeated. Okay, and so you move to quantity of imports into a region. Well, you decide to bring in a certain amount, and it's going to be distributed between the firms that want to purchase, the private household that wants to make the purchases, the government that wants the purchase, and the imports. Okay, and so here's the total import bundle in percentage change, and it's going to be share weighted. So these are the value shares by firm. They may want some of those imports to use as inputs. Private household may be buying those for final use, and they'll have a value share, and a value share here for government and investment. These value shares, right, are going to be divided by whatever the total value of the left-hand side was. So there was a value there that's divided by 1, just like up here when we had the, I think it was VCB, right? So this is VCB over VCB, and then VCB is the denominator making all these shares. Well, there'll be some value term here that is the denominator for all of these, making those shares add up to 1. So what do we get? Share weighted sales adding up. The share weighted change, percentage change, and all the sales options is equal to the percentage change in the supply. And here's like the import supply, right? The border agent brings this stuff into the market. You know, there's this good that sits there in the international market. We're going to import some. Think of it as a broker, maybe an import broker brings it in. And where's the balance at? Well, the purchases of imports by the firms, private, government, and investment uses must balance up to that in share weighted terms. We have one more thing to account for here. It's in this equation, and it's in a few other of these balance equations. It's called TRD slack. Okay, and it's a term on its own, right? So it's added to this equation on the right hand side, and it's commodity and region specific, and it's in red. And it's in red because it's different than the green equation, the green terms. It's exogenous in a normal setup, and so we should interrogate slack variables just a little bit. But to get a feel for it, imagine this was endogenous. Okay, imagine it was one of the variables that's solved for in the model. Then we have a percentage change that is supposed to be exactly equal to, right? If you go all the way back to the first part of presentation 1 in this module, this percentage change comes from us multiplying by the quantity and then the price, so that we had a value as a pre-multiplier, a value here, and then we divided through. But really, it all traces itself back to an accounting identity. All the stuff that you make has to be purchased, okay? And as long as the common price exists, then the quantity of the transactions has to hold, okay? And so since it has to hold that way, this share weighted version completely consistently derived from that accounting identity should account for all the difference, okay? Any adjustment to the left hand side is going to be made up of partial or share weighted adjustments to this variable QDS, QXS, and QST. So what's the role for trade slack? Well, if you left it endogenous, you're out there solving for something that can take up imbalances between the left hand side and the right hand side. It's a slack variable that's exogenous, and so right now when it's exogenous, it says make this 0. We're not going to shock it. It's not a variable that we want to shock. So you make it 0, and it forces the equilibrium to hold. If for some reason it isn't 0, it's allowed to adjust in the solution to the model, then you're accommodating imbalances. Okay, and so it must be there for a reason. And so we have a reason. So if there's a slack variable and you see it in an equation, it's worth thinking about and worth reading under that variable's definition. Why is it written that way? Why is that slack variable there? And what it really is the case. So slack variables are meant to be exogenous in the closure. So you set it exogenous, it equals 0, it stays 0 the whole time, and all of the normal terms derived from the accounting system have to balance up. But there could be cases, maybe, where you want to run a partial equilibrium experiment. You want to turn off market clearing somewhere and shock the price, right? So you have some partial equilibrium experiment, maybe just to measure some elasticities. There's a sort of you start digging around GTAP literature after you've been at this for a year, you'll see something called the partial equilibrium elasticity, and it's a set of experiments that people run just to sort of get these summary elasticities. What are the sort of summary supply elasticities in partial equilibrium? And then there's another one called the general equilibrium elasticity, where people want to shock the prices. So you want to go and shock a price by 1% just to see what the responses are on the demand side. Well, you might want to turn off the market clearing condition, because the market clearing condition determines the price. Okay, or you may want to narrow down to a few particular sectors and run something like a partial equilibrium commodity model for wool and lambs and whatever. And so, in theory, this trade slack, turning off some of the market clearing conditions, would allow you to do that. Okay, so anywhere you see a slack variable, it is itself an advanced topic. We will talk about closure, and changing the closure comes in the phase 2 of the model. For now, we are just we're trying to make our way through all the things we can see, right, and get a good sort of primary definition of those. And for now, I think that's what we want to do. When you see a slack variable, one, recognize it should be exogenous under a normal, what we would call closure for the model. The way the general equilibrium is set up, that needs to be 0 and stay 0. Why is it there? Then that's when you can start interrogating in these sort of advanced topics. Why do they have a slack variable here? What might be a condition where I want to use it? Is it that I want to bring in something like unemployment, right? Allow that there's some pool of workers that don't get hired or something like that. So think about those conditions. Beyond the commodities, we have the endowments. There's 3 classes. We have the mobile, sluggish, and sector specific. Not going to go through these in the code. You're welcome to go look them up, but we will see more of these later in the thinking about the advanced portions of the course that come after the online prep. But the main thing is, if something is classified as mobile, which typically capital and labor are, then you'll get a common economy-wide return, right? So every sale of labor and every purchase balances out in an aggregate condition to give a common price. If something is sluggish, then it moves with friction. There's some elasticity that tells you how costly or how far from perfectly mobile you are, and the endowment supplier will choose to maximize returns based on this sort of ability, or this limited ability, imperfect mobility of the sector for being used in different things. In standard GTAP setup, the sluggish factor is land, and it means that if you're currently employing your land planted to rice, then it could be converted to other uses, other agricultural uses, primary agricultural uses. So you're growing rice in rice paddies. You want to grow wheat. Well, you can do that, but there's some. It's not a perfect conversion. It's not perfect mobility. It's not perfectly moved over. Whereas GTAP tells you the worker, the labor employed in production of a cotton or wool sweater, they could be easily moved to employment in restaurants. That's the treatment there. And so obviously when you start thinking through the examples, and this is part of why the endowments get discussed more later in the course, you're thinking about length of run and closure. You're thinking about where is this model, what's the time horizon over which you would say there's a lot of mobility for people, and then maybe even more importantly for capital, right? So the capital being used into a restaurant versus a factory. So over what time horizon can that sort of shift happen as a flow, right? So I'll just say the normal sort of GTAP horizon is 2 to 4 years. You're solving the model, and it's really defined by this idea that the typical GTAP closure has capital being a mobile endowment. In about 2 years, you can do a lot of conversion to get that pricing, a 2-year horizon where capital prices sort of equilibrate. And then, of course, you have some sector-specific factors. So they exist as endowments, but they really only have one use. They don't move around. So they have really the zero profits condition of the sector. They only have one source of demand, and the zero profits is going to entirely determine their prices. So their value and use in that particular sector will always determine what they're worth. The only sector-specific factor in the sort of normal version 7 setup is natural resources. Okay, so this is what these different versions of these equations look like. So they're in levels form here, just because it's probably the easier way to look at them. And so here we're saying, again, you could go back to presentation 1 and think about how you go through this and get a percentage change version. And in fact, where it is non-trivial, we'll show you the percentage change version. But here we have the level QES, QFE. This is the sector specific. So this endowment must be sold to this activity in this region. They're the only purchaser. So those two things just had to balance out. So it's, that's just an equation that says this thing is the same as this thing. Moving up here to the top for the mobile endowments, it says there's a supply, and it must be equal to the demand when you account for all the activity uses of this endowment. Okay, and so this is the balance condition that's going to give you an economy-wide price. Okay, so we'll get a sector-specific price here, but it's not very different than what we're thinking about up here because there's only one destination, right? If you're selling this, there's only one place that buys it. Their production and their markets will determine what the value is. Here, there's competition, right? It's essentially costless. It's highly mobile, right? Perfectly mobile. And so factor demands, prices that cause one sector to bid up the price of capital or labor, cause the other ones to release it. And that must be balanced off, right, with the fact that the total supply is equal to the summation of demands by activities. Here, when you get to the middle part, is where things get interesting or a little bit complicated. So we have a level of supply for this sluggish endowment that is sector specific, right? So it's the supply of some endowment to some activity in the region, and it's going to be governed by this equation. Okay, and so the endowment, the level of the endowment pre-multiplied by this price ratio, this elasticity, and this sort of scaling factor, all of which, this could be endowment specific, and this can be completely specific. So if you don't recognize it, it looks a lot like the CES equation that we saw way back when, and that one had a nice linearized version, and so there's an equivalency here to the linearized version that says the factor supply to a specific activity is proportional to the change in the factor supply, which will normally be zero, right? We have fixed factors at the aggregate level in this model. So the amount of capital, the amount of labor, the amount of land, it's a static amount. Part of the closure, again, we talk about closure and advanced sort of examinations of closure, an advanced topic, but sort of the normal closure rule says that these endowments are just in fixed supply. And so it's really a constraint. How much endowment you have at the start of a equilibrium solution is really a constraint on just what can be done, and on the sort of, the existing technology plus the input availability of primary factors, and then the ability of purchase inputs to substitute for those really puts that frontier, the production frontier, together. And so it's that constraining side. So these fixed endowments are key to that. They're key to linking the equilibrium results across the economy as well. But anyway, so the percentage change in supply to a specific activity is going to be proportional to this, which we expect to be zero. And then it's going to have this a second term which says what is the price or the net return or the percentage change in the return for supplying to this sector versus the average return. Okay, and so you have this elasticity here. It's called the elasticity of transformation. It is not at all unlike, it's related to this. Okay, this scale term goes away in the differentiation, but this elasticity survives to pre-multiply this. If you think about log differentials, this factor right here moves down to become the pre-multiplier of log of PES minus PE sub E. That's supposed to be a subscript there. And so what you end up with if you finish out that differentiation is this transformation parameter, which describes something about the frontier over which you're able to, how much curvature is there. So if you have perfect mobility, there's no curvature, it's just straight line. If there's better returns somewhere else, shift the stuff somewhere else, balance it out till we get that, till all of the percentage change returns are equilibrated across all the uses. Okay, here it's saying that perfect mobility doesn't exist. It's going to be governed by this, whatever the shape this puts on it, or whatever sort of the friction you might think about this puts on movements. And so you get the rewards relative to this will determine. So we'll be calculating from all the different supply prices an average price of supplying this factor, this endowment. Let's think of it as land. And so the average land price compared to what the land will earn in rice production determines, multiplied by, this elasticity determines how much up or down we expect the supply of land to rice production to move. Okay, and so think about it. If returns to rice are going up relative to this, then we expect movement towards that. This is a zero term here, and so this elasticity modulated term here will tend to drive up the supply to the specific sector where the returns are growing. Okay, not to get too deep into closures, just to remind you of something I've already said. The standards, so if you take GTAP off the shelf and use the closure as provided, the mobile endowments will be capital and labor, and there could be several different types of labor. Sluggish endowments, land, only agriculture actually has land, right? So one of the sort of odd things is land exists as an input, and it may show up in equations with results, but the only sectors, the only activities that have land in their cost function are agricultural production. Okay, and so for our example model, that would be food. Food has all of the agriculture plus all the processed food items in it. And the sector-specific endowments are natural resources. Okay, we said we would also look at the income equation one more time, just to get a look at it here. And it's appropriate as we just finished thinking about the endowments. So all those returns to endowments matter. They flow up to the top level of the, if you go back to where we were looking at circular flow, they flow up and become changes to income. And so here you see regional income is equal to the sum of primary factor income plus indirect tax receipts. Okay, so those are the collected values of the taxes. And on this equation is written a little differently. So on the left-hand side, it's almost as though it's well, you can see how it's written here. So it's the income level multiplied by the percentage change in regional income. So take the percentage change times this, and what you're getting is the component change, right? So you're getting the delta income. And it's made up of the change to factor income. So this is the sort of starting level of factor income. So add up all of the value of returns to land, labor, and capital, natural resources in the model, and multiply by the percentage change in factor income. So there must be an equation that's determining factor income. And you can navigate through this and go see how it all works if you like. But what we're really after here is this balance between the total income for the region, the factor income being multiplied here, indirect taxes that are proportional to income, and then we have this slack variable. Okay, so if you wanted to break the income accounting side of the model, this is the slack variable you would use, and it has to be pre-multiplied by income because this side is. All right, we got one more thing in here that matters, and it's the reason this equation is written this way is, well, indirect tax receipts, think about it, as a percentage change variable, we might be concerned that we switch from being net net positive to net negative. Okay, and so we're putting a percentage change on that. We may not have the right look of what we want. And so what we do is we use an ordinary change variable. So this is the absolute, or the whatever you want to call it, ordinary change in indirect tax receipts multiplied by the income level, right? So that's the modulator, and then we'll put the 100 in front of it, right, to put it in percentage to get because this is in percentage change, and this is in percentage change, and this is in percentage change, and this is in percentage change. We have to multiply this by 100, and so that's what there are a few equations here in the model that look like this, really accounting for the fact that things may change from above 0 to below 0 and cause our percentage change equations a little bit of a problem. So we anticipate where those are. Other places where it happens, you get a failure of the model because we don't expect the value of labor to go negative, right? If it goes negative, we have an issue in the model. So we write those, or the value of the commodities sold, we don't expect those to go negative. And so the model fails if those happen. Here, we need to be able to allow for the fact that the indirect tax receipts could change just based on a bunch of policies that adjust. Okay, with that, I think that probably gets us to the end of our second presentation. So we tried to think a little bit of, in many ways, this entire module is a look ahead. So we're trying to piece together the things from the 4 modules before, but in the process of doing that, we're seeing a lot of things that don't get tackled in depth until we get to the second phase of the course, where you do your intensive study on some advanced topics. And those are organized the same way. You'll go back to production, and you'll get a deeper understanding of production, and a deeper understanding of demand. That's the way this course is set up. So you get this introductory level stuff where we try to leave out the trade, try to leave out some of the harder sort of equilibrium closure concepts, so in many ways this final module of our online prep is as much previewing things as others. So with that said, there is a review quiz, and of course if you have questions, which that's one, it's good, because it's probably going to show up on the first or second day of our second phase training, when you move on to the next part of this course. But yeah, questions to clarify, to gain some comfort with whatever was presented here, obviously send those to us, and that'll be a close on presentation 2.